Sunday School teacher, I am glad that you have joined us for our time of study and preparation. I'm Tim Smith with Sunday School University, and today we are working on the lesson for Sunday, November the 9th. The title of this lesson is Undivided Worship, and we continue in our study in the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to be in chapter 12. The point of this lesson, entitled Undivided Worship, is that believers are to avoid idols and worship God alone. Idolatry is literally making a god. Idolatry is when humans who are made in the image of God make a god with their own hands in an attempt to fulfill their own needs. In Old Testament times, idols were made by carving wood, chiseling stone, or casting metal. We all have a God-sized hole in our hearts, and that hole can only be filled by God alone. This chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 12, focuses on worship and makes the distinctiveness of the covenant God its primary concern. Namely, there are no others beside Him. So let's look at these. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, remove idolatry. Be careful to follow these statutes and ordinances in the land that the Lord, the God of our fathers, has given you to possess all the days you live on earth. Destroy completely all the places where the nations that you are driving out worship their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. Tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, cut down the carved images of their gods, and wipe out their names from every place. Don't worship the Lord your God this way. Instead, turn to the place the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes to put His name for His dwelling and go there. You are to bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tenths and personal contributions, your vow offering, your free will offering, the firstborn of your herds and flock. You will eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your household in everything you do, because the Lord your God has blessed you. So here in these verses 1 through 3, they are instructed upon entering the promised land and coming into Canaan and taking the land, they were to destroy the local shrines devoted to the worship of the Canaanite gods. In the pagan religions of Canaan, outdoor shrines known as high places were usually dedicated to the Canaanite god Baal. But the Ammonites' god Molech and the Moabite god Chemosh were also worshipped in these high places. God's call for the Israelites to wipe them out was comprehensive and complete. Being obedient to this command was a call for the utter destruction of all of these idols. Verses 4 through 5, the Israelites were told to worship God in a different way and in a separate place. he says, don't worship the way the pagans do. So how did the pagans worship? Well, basically, the way they worshiped was, let's make a deal. That was the way the pagans worshiped. I'll worship you, now you work for me. They treated their pagan gods, their idols, as like a lucky rabbit's foot. I'll worship you, but you gotta do something for me. Don't do that. That's not the way it works. You worship God, Yahweh God, for who He is. It's not let's make a deal. He says, get rid of those. And again, at this point, God had not chosen Jerusalem to be the place. Here in verses 6 and 7, in Canaan they would establish one central sanctuary that would be recognized as the Lord's dwelling place. And so here, what matters most is not where of worship, but who Israel was commanded to worship. He alone is worthy. God commanded His people to worship Him in the ways that He prescribed. Again, the pagans, they individually chose how they would worship these idols. And they talk about these offerings and these sacrifices. These that are mentioned here in these verses 6 and 7 involved a costly ritual instituted by God. Thus, worship was not driven by the adherent's need or desires, but it was God's command. Verses 8 through 11, we see worship God. You are not to do as we are doing here today. Everyone is doing whatever seems right in his own sight. Indeed, you have not yet come into the resting place and the inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and He gives you rest from all your enemies around you, and you live in security, then the Lord your God will choose the place to have His name dwell. Bring there everything I've commanded you, your burnt offerings, sacrifices, offerings of tenth, personal contributions, and all the choice offerings you vow to the Lord. Here in verses 8 and 9, now that God, through Moses, had declared that there would be a centralized place of worship, He contrasted it with the Israelites' manner of worship that had been going on since Sinai. He's emphasizing the importance of corporate worship, not just individual worship. The emphasis is on a coming time when the Israelites would enter into the promised land. And yes, there would be a centralization of the worship of Yahweh. In verses 10 through 11, it would only be when they crossed the Jordan and settled in the promised land that God would give them finally the rest and security from all the enemies. The first place that was chosen was Shiloh. That's about 30 miles north of Jerusalem. One of the points of a centralized place for worship of the Lord was to protect the Israelites from the dangers of being pulled into the practices of pagan religions and becoming acclimated to the surrounding pagan cultures. So he says in verses 29 through 32, stand firm. Chapter 12, 29 through 32. When the Lord your God annihilates the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and you drive them out and live in their land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods, asking, how did these nations worship their gods? I'll also do the same. You must not do the same to the Lord your God, because they practice every detestable act which the Lord hates for their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire of their gods. Be careful to do everything I command you, and do not add anything to it or take anything away from it. Here in verse 29, we see Moses say that God Himself would aid the Israelites in their military battles to take the Promised Land. It's important to remember that God's intervention on behalf of Israel was rooted in their covenantal relationship with God. In this relationship, God protected the Israelites from their enemies. We also know that there were times when God gave them over to their enemies because the Israelites had rebelled against God and His covenant. Verses 30 through 32, God warned them to be careful to avoid being ensnared by the worship of pagan gods, the pagan gods of the Canaanites. They were not to adopt any of the Canaanite worship practices or incorporate them into Israelite worship. It says here in these verses, don't inquire. Have you ever heard that curiosity kills the cat? Well, that's what he's talking about here. Don't be curious. It's wrong. What they did was wrong. That's it. Settles it. Ignoring the divine commands against worshiping other gods would violate the covenant relationship between God and Israel. So as we teach this, summary of these verses, number one, believers should be prepared to recognize and avoid false gods. Number two, we are to worship the Lord by bringing our offerings to Him. And number three, believers should be strong spiritually, worshiping God alone. Creating interest in this lesson. Do you think God cares about where and how people worship Him? Why? And then also talking about why corporate worship is so important for believers. Why do we need that? Why do we need to gather and worship the Lord together? Why can't we just do it by ourselves? And then the application, the closing. Get the group talking about what would help our giving feel more like a celebration than an obligation. When we give an offering, when we put the money in the offering plate, what would help that to be more like a celebration rather than an obligation? And then also, what actions can we take to safeguard from being drawn away? What do we need to, what guardrails can we put in our lives to protect us from being drawn into the pagan culture of today? Remember, the lesson is entitled Undivided Worship. Believers are to avoid idols and worship God alone. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this coming Sunday. God bless you.